Jack made his way carefully following the guide ropes, lighting his path by torchlight. Jack turned from the final dark section of the cave and could see the daylight illuminating the cave entrance. He squinted as his eyes adjusted, stinging from the light. He hadn't seen daylight in almost a year. Warm air from above ground began to dry his skin. His ears rang as the cacophony of sounds above ground, the birds, the wind, tangled into one humming, whirring, ringing drone that boomed through the cave and overwhelmed his brain. Jack sat and leaned his back against the cave wall as he prepared himself, putting on his hat for cover from the sunlight, before heading above ground to collect the bananas. Jack had been old enough to run solo missions through the caves for nearly 5 years now. The caves were over a kilometer below the surface of the earth, reaching roughly 300 meters wide at their widest and almost 100 meters high at their highest. This cave system he and his tribe inhabited extended thousands of kilometers. At junctions, it could branch in half a dozen directions or more. The cave floor was rugged and unforgiving, Jack's shins scarred from the years of trips and falls, but his people knew the paths well. Guide ropes strung through each cave helped them find their way. He was currently on a mission to a sector near the surface called Banana Cave, where his tribe harvested bananas from acres of trees above ground. Supplied with large packs, he could return with about a month's supply for his tribe. Jack checked his sand dial was set before heading out of the cave. He would have roughly 15 minutes to gather the bananas before the above-ground elements would begin to send his body into shock. He finished checking his packs and took a deep breath before beginning the final climb. As he hauled himself up the steep slope of the cave entrance, a rock wobbled under his right foot, and he quickly shifted his foot to a stable rock. He could hear it tumbling down the slope, seeming to dislodge more rocks on the way. Jack froze, clenching his teeth in worry, and shone his torch back into the cave. A grumbling echoed from the gut of the cave, the rocks around him shifting and breaking apart. The rocks had caused a collapse, he feared. He scrambled up the slope towards the daylight as the grumbling grew louder, when then a roar of wind blew out his torch, and he tumbled to the ground. Jack opened his eyes and was laying on his side. It was bright. He was lying in a pit of rubble. He couldn't remember how he got there. He might be dreaming. His hat was gone, and his clothes were badly torn. His sand dial lay next to him, cracked, but intact. He started to remember a collapse had occurred. He had been climbing up the cave entrance. His right hand buzzed, distant and foreign to his own body. He patted his right arm, starting at his bicep, until he felt a jagged crest pressing up against his skin. It was broken. He began shouting in hopes that someone from the caves could hear him. He continued shouting until he tired, and accepted that he was alone. Jack stumbled to his feet to try to assess his surroundings. His eyes could not process the bright, above-ground light, the world appearing blurry around him. His skin felt singed from whatever length of time he had been laying in the pit and exposed to the sun. The pit seemed about 10 meters deep. The collapse had come fully to the cave entrance. The slope he had climbed was gone. He scanned the rubble, moving small rocks and larger boulders to find a path through. There was none. It was an immense amount of rubble. It would be a long time before anyone got through, if ever. The pit would not be deep enough to keep him fully protected from the above-ground air and sunlight and allow him to survive in the elements. He gave one last yell, but nothing. He had to find another way back into the caves. Jack rearranged some rocks and created a divot for himself with an overhang in the pit for better cover from the sunlight. He was exhausted, starving. He had been gone for over a day now. His right arm was cold and damp as he sat in the pit. A dark streak of water was running down the boulder and being sopped up by his shirt. He was ecstatic at the discovery. He cupped his hand, pressing the side of them against the streak until he created a small puddle for him to drink. He sipped, then licked at his hand desperately. He did this a dozen more times until he quenched his thirst, and then collapsed in his divot and passed out from exhaustion. Jack woke with the sunlight the next morning. Lucky to still be alive, he thought. He took a drink from the streak of water before taking a large breath and gathering his strength. He flipped his sand dial and made his way out of the cave to find some bananas. Not going far from the pit, he scanned the land for anything to eat. He couldn't make out any sort of vegetation. The land was bare. He bent down and moved his hands along the ground, only feeling some small twigs and rocks. No bananas. Had the above-grounders picked the area clean? Had they removed the banana trees his people relied on? The older cave-dwellers suspected an act like this might be coming. Almost before Jack's time, nearly 20 years ago, the cave-dwellers had tunneled underneath the above-ground city of Halldale, looting many of their most prized resources and possessions. There had been no interaction between the two tribes since, no retaliation, just simmering tensions. Amongst the empty land, Jack collapsed and screamed in desperation. He contemplated the bright world up here as his sand dial trickled down. Every sense he had was in pain. His skin burned, his eyes stung, his ears throbbed, his breath short. He thought he was fading away when he heard something different among the cacophony of sounds. It sounded like voices. He propped himself up on his elbow and scanned around. He could see two figures moving in the distance. They must have heard him yelling. Had they seen him? Should he keep lying there? He was completely exposed. Jack laid low, keeping his eyes on the growing figures. They were heading towards him. The figures appeared to be two young girls. He didn't know what to do. He could run back to the pit, but they would surely see him and follow him. Would they attack him? He decided to get up and make a run for it towards the pit. But his blurry vision and unsure footing on the soft ground failed him, and he fell, the world going static when he bumped his broken arm. He looked back. The two figures were rushing steadily towards him. "Hey, man!" a slightly larger, older-seeming girl shouted. Jack had never encountered above-grounders before. This was their territory. He felt like a baby up here, helpless and scared. He studied as best he could with his blurry vision, trying to make out what they looked like. They looked similar to his people. Taller, perhaps. Darker, definitely. They moved confidently. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" the younger-seeming girl called. He forced himself up. They stopped as he was finally upright, observing him, and became hesitant, and then started moving back in the direction they came. Jack was squinting as the sunlight burned his eyes. His sundial had nearly run out. He paused to think, his mind scattered, trying to focus his eyes. He didn't know what to do. Should he try to get help from these people? Would he find anyone else up here to help him? They may send more above-grounders and take him hostage. His broken arm was throbbing. He didn't want to rot away in the pit. Jack yelled, "Hey!" and raised his left arm weakly, a greeting gesture. Would they even recognize it? They stopped and turned back to look at him. Jack continued to wave his arm back and forth in an attempt to appear friendly. They reluctantly began walking towards him. As they approached, they seemed to be walking on eggshells, stopping about 10 meters from him. The older girl appeared to hold her arm out to stop the younger one from approaching any closer. "You look like a cave dweller. Shouldn't you be getting back?" the older-seeming girl asked. She spoke quickly and loudly, her loud voice slightly bothering Jack's ears. "His skin's so pale. He looks lost," the younger girl whispered. Jack muttered, not able to find the words. He looks blind," the younger girl whispered again. "Be careful, Morgan," the older one said. "He could be here to attack our city, or something," the younger one said. "This was a bad idea. We should go," the older one responded. The older girl grabbed the younger one's arm and began to turn away. Please, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm lost. I need help," Jack said. The girl scanned him suspiciously. Jack shifted to put his broken arm on display, grimacing. The searing pain had been building since he'd woken up. "Holy shit," the younger yelled, looking at the jagged, bruised lump. "Fuck," Jack said, grasping his arm and kneeling down to brace himself. I really need some help. Please, I'm so fucked." "What happened to you?" the older girl asked. Jack stumbled over his words, trying to explain his situation. The older one said they didn't believe him. He continued pleading with them as the sand dial ran out. He took them to the pit to show them the collapse. He stumbled, losing his footing a few times on the way. The girl seemed to become more relaxed, not keeping such a distance from him, seeing how poorly he navigated. The older one told him there had recently been terrible fires that wiped out all of the trees, and her and Morgan were scoping out the damage. Jack was wheezing, trying to gain a breath from the dry air. "You are well and truly fucked," the older one said. She pulled a bottle of water from her pack and handed it to him. "Here." He drank it desperately. He sat down on a boulder in the pit. "My skin is killing me, and all the goddamn noise. I have such a headache." He rubbed some water on his bare arms and poured some onto his head. The older one left the pit to talk privately with the younger one. The younger one seemed to disagree with whatever they were discussing. They spoke for a while, forcefully quieting their voices as they seemed to argue, occasionally looking back at him. The older one returned. "I'm going to get you some food and supplies. I won't tell anyone we found you. Don't need any of that drama. Let's just get you back home," the older girl said. She took a deep breath, seeming to take on an air of responsibility. "What's your name?" "Jack," he replied. "I'm Ellie. That's Morgan. Wait here," the older girl said brightly. It'll be a few hours, but hang tight. Thank you, Jack smiled. Jack was curled in his divot later in the evening when Ellie returned. He wasn't sure if she would actually come back, or, maybe, her tribe would have stopped her. Did she have more people with her? It didn't sound like it. He was starving. Ellie settled next to him in the divot, unloading a pack of supplies. Here, I brought some herbs. Chew on them and suck the juices. Your arm should feel better, Ellie said. Soothing warmth began flooding Jack's arm, and he began to feel tingly and tranquil. The ringing of his ears toned down, and his headache began to dissipate. For a moment, he could distinguish the chirps of the birds from the large cauldron of sounds. It was a nice, pleasant distraction. Give me your arm, Ellie said, cradling his broken arm gently. Our tribe tells stories about you cave dwellers. Say we can't trust you since the raid on Halldale. They say you're preparing to raid our cities again. That's not true. We just want peace, Jack replied. Better be. Ellie quickly jolted his broken arm back into a straight line. Jack screamed in horror, looking at her in disbelief. Was that supposed to be funny? She couldn't prepare him? He supposed the element of surprise was the whole point. He gasped for several dry breaths as he felt faint. Ellie then fastened a board along his forearm with some rope. Take these herbs whenever you're in pain, Ellie said, and I brought you some food. Eat. Jack was still moaning in pain, but now also moaning in relief for the food. He gulped down some pieces of dried meat with ravenous hunger. It was tastier than any underground meat he was used to. It was fattier and had a smoother, milder flavor. Drool pooled in his mouth and dripped down his chin. Ellie sat with a serious look on her face, her hand in an L shape on her chin. What's your plan? Jack hadn't thought seriously about his plan. He'd been purely focusing on surviving each minute above ground. He was tired and wanted to sleep, but supposed it was as good a time as any to start thinking. He wiped the drool from his chin. I don't know. I guess I need to get to another cave entrance. That's my only hope. Are there any other entrances nearby? Mountain cave, maybe. That would be the closest one from underground. I can try to follow the path of the caves from above ground, Jack replied. The mountains, those are a few days' journey. I can't stay above ground that long. I could maybe make it above ground for 2 hours, worst case scenario, Jack said. Even for the one visit Jack had above ground, his eyes continued to sting from the effect of the sunlight. The dry air had chapped his mouth, throat, and lungs, and his skin was beginning to blister. What if you found shelter, like this pit? Break up the trip. You could rest in those. Sure, if I can find some, but I don't know how to survive up here or navigate. You'll find shelters along the way. I've seen plenty, and I'll show you how to navigate and live up here. We can test out going short distances, start small, and once you're comfortable, you can try to go all the way, Ellie said. Sounds like a plan, Jack said semi-confidently. I'll get you some better clothes to cover your body, and a hat, Ellie said. Thank you, Jack said. He was grateful he found her. Without her, he may have already died. Thank you so much for your help, helping a cave dweller like me. Well, you're just another person. You seem nice. It's what anyone should do, she said, smiling. He knew not all above-grounders would help. She was particularly kind. He noticed how she was now moving slower around him and watched him less intently. She acted without any sort of fear toward him. She seemed to trust him. I have to go now. Have a good night. I'll bring some more food tomorrow. The pitch of her voice wasn't quite like anyone he knew below ground. He was getting used to the way she spoke quicker and louder than he was used to. He liked her voice. The depth of it sounded pretty. He wondered whether this would be his last time seeing her. Good night, Ellie. Will you come back? Jack asked anxiously. I'll be back. Trust me. Jack smiled with comfort. The next morning, Jack woke to Ellie nudging him in his divot. She had more food, and long clothes and a hat, which he donned. After eating, they stood on the grassy hill near the pit. Jack flipped the sand dial. The warm, soft ground of the jungle felt nice on his feet, like he was sinking into it. Which direction does the cave go? Ellie asked. Jack paused, thinking, squinting his eyes and trying to make out his surroundings. Sorry, my head hurts. Don't focus on what's up here. Try to picture the caves and find the direction. Jack's headache quelled slightly, and he managed to picture the path from the cave entrance. That way, he said, coughing, pointing out into the open land. Breathe slower, through your nose. That should make it easier. Here, have some water. Jack tried relaxing his breath, Moving his breath through the nose filtered the air and kept it moist, causing less irritation to his throat and lungs. "Let's start that way, and we'll stop when you think the path changes," Ellie said. She led the way, moving swiftly and confidently, Jack moving slowly and stumbling along the soft ground, feeling around the environment for obstacles, trying desperately not to fall. "Hurry up," she said, laughing. Jack chuckled. She had a funny laugh, like a high-pitched wail. He continued to follow Ellie and joined her after about 200 yards. "I like the way you move, so careful and cautious. It's cute, but you're going to have to pick it up." "Where from here?" Ellie asked. "Over there, I think," he said. "Everything's just a blur. There's nothing I recognize as a landmark." Jack sighed in dejection. "You don't have to see perfectly. If you can just see some shades. Light and dark, can you see that?" "Yeah, a bit," Jack replied unconfidently. "The bushes and rocks are dark against the light background. Try to piece together some shapes, using the dark objects as landmarks against the light sky and ground. You see that big bush to the left? Looks like an upside-down triangle?" Jack glared into the distance. He forcefully focused his eyes in the direction Ellie had suggested, and began to make out a faint boundary between some dark objects in the light sky. It was a couple of blurry blobs. "Right over there?" he asked, then clenching his burning eyes. "Nice. Okay, let's go that way," Ellie said encouragingly. She folded his hand in hers and moved along with him for a little while. Her hand was gentle, confident, and caring. He liked the soft feel of her skin. Jack carefully followed her path, moving slowly but more confidently in her wake. She seemed to move without worry. They approached the big bush. "Look back. There are two big rocks where we came from. Can you see them?" she asked, leaning in and pointing to the spot. "Yes," Jack said, weakly, placing his hands on his knees as the pain of his organs culminated in a throbbing headache. The sandal began to run out. They returned to the pit for Jack to recover. After about 5 or 6 hours, Jack seemed to have regained some strength back. He noticed, as he rested when breathing slowly, the dry air could actually feel crisp and refreshing, like taking a drink of water. It revitalized him. Later, they retraced the path to the bush that looked like an upside-down triangle. Ellie looked at Jack questioningly. "I think I have to head towards that tree trunk out there," Jack said, pointing into the distance. "Perfect. You're doing it," Ellie said joyfully. "You're practically an above-grounder now." Ellie's positivity lifted Jack's spirits. He started to believe he could pull this off. They practiced until nightfall and had almost traced the way to the third turn of the cave. They started a fire in the pit for the night, creating a bowl of light and warmth, and Ellie stayed for a while to keep Jack company before she had to head back home. Over the next 3 days, Jack followed Ellie and made good progress. They found an underground shelter after the third turn of the cave that would be deep enough for Jack to rest in. He began to move more confidently with every step. They had finally crossed out of the bare, fire-stricken land, and the hardy jungle swelled around them. He now had more landmarks to navigate and resources for food along the way. He embraced the soft, squishy ground and the sound of the crunchy vegetation under his feet. He loved the way the light created colorful shadows in the surroundings, the scents that wafted in the environment. Every day, they traced more turns of the cave above ground than the day before, finding more small, dark oases along the way for Jack. They enjoyed nighttime fires together, and Ellie stayed longer with him each night, chatting more about their lives back home, laughing together, sharing their dreams and future plans. Once, she even stayed an entire night when he felt too scared to sleep. Though the sun was taking a toll on Jack's exposed face, his exposed skin was getting damaged, starting to blister and draw blood, and his vision was becoming blurry. He began to like the way the sunlight made him feel. It was soothing in a primitive way, and nourishing, even though he could only take so much nourishment. It made him feel like he had been born again, started a new life. He also liked having Ellie around, the way she moved without worry above ground, how she encouraged him whenever he lost his way. She was loving and caring. She told him that she liked the way he acted above ground, as a product of his blindness, that he seemed to think about things more than she was used to, considering everything around him. He felt a bond developing between them. Knowing that she was there for him gave him hope. He began to wonder what Ellie looked like if she were not blurry. She seemed pretty. They had now traced almost 5 hours of the journey. "When will you set off?" Ellie asked as they sat around the nighttime fire, her palms facing the fire for warmth. "You mean for good?" Jack said, removing a charred piece of meat from the fire. "Yeah, for good. I'm getting the hang of it. I'm just not sure if I should keep practicing." But your face is getting damaged up here. Look at your blisters. And your eyes are completely bloodshot, Ellie said with a concerned look, leaning in to more closely inspect his face. They're getting worse. Jack studied the shadows flickering on the walls of the glowing bowl, scratching his head. Will you come with me? I can't go any further with you. I've spent as much time as I can. My tribe is getting suspicious of me. Jack looked down at the ground. He felt his sun-blistered face. He thought about what it would be like navigating without Ellie, whether he could do it. I don't want to leave you, he said, looking at her. You have to leave eventually. You can't just die in this pit. Jack thought about how much longer he could keep training, and at what point he would be too damaged to attempt the full journey. One more day, then, he said with a tone of acceptance. Sure, one more day. Go alone tomorrow, as far as you can. I'll go home and bring as much food as possible. But you'll also find food along the way. Stock up at that apple orchard we found today. Jack stared into the flickering light of the fire, blankly. He had trouble sleeping that night. He tossed and turned with thoughts of his upcoming journey. The next day, Jack made his way almost an hour past the most recent checkpoint. It was scary without Ellie by his side to encourage him, to make him feel safe. He moved slower, but gained confidence as he successfully located all of the landmarks and navigated back to the pit by himself. He met Ellie at the mouth of the cave as the sun was setting. She was already there with 2 large bags of food and a large jug of water. She spent the night with him, as it was their last night together. The next morning, Jack slept in. He felt gloomy. He was not quick to get moving. He eventually got up and sat with Ellie near the dwindling fire. The embers were still hot from the night before. He had been silent since he had woken up. I'm going to miss you, he said, softly, looking at her face. I'm going to miss you, too. Will I get to see you again? Unless you can clear that collapse, I don't think so, Ellie said, somberly. Jack felt glum. I wish I could live up here, stay with you. I really like being with you up here. It's been fun. But you have your whole family, Jack. You have to get back to your life, and I have to get back to mine. Jack rubbed his face in contemplation, knowing it was the truth, but not wanting to accept it. Ellie helped him with his things out of the pit. Jack took a deep breath and sighed. He was nervous, but confident in his preparation. He envisioned making it home. All righty, hit the road, Jack, Ellie said, cheekily. Jack stared out along his path, tracing the route in his head. He partially joked. I'm a dead man. You're a handsome dead man, for your information, she said, smiling at him. Well, thanks, he responded, looking at her face and blushing slightly. Jack wished he could see her clearly. Thank you for everything, Ellie. You're a beautiful person. She walked up to him, reached out to hold his hand, looked into his eyes, and wrapped her arms around him. It's been nice knowing you, Jack. They hugged. As they released their embrace, she raised onto her toes and looked into his eyes and gave him a kiss. Jack took a deep breath and raised his chest as he prepared himself. Bye, Ellie. He turned to begin his journey, looking occasionally back at Ellie's blurry figure where she remained, waving back at him. After he crested a hill near the first turn, she vanished. The tribe was happy to have Jack back, but he spent the days after returning mostly inactive. He split his time withdrawn, sitting by the tribe's communal fire, or laying in his room within his family's dwelling that was carved into the side of the cave system. He thought it was unfair that he couldn't be with someone, even if they were the only person he wanted to love. Jack sat at his family's dinner table, following a meal spent ruminating over his time above ground. The rocky dome of his family's dwelling hung 30 feet above them, the rock floor smoothed from generations of foot traffic, the walls adorned with knickknacks that had been retrieved from the caves and above ground. You can't be with that woman, Jack, his father said, his voice echoing softly through the domed living space. Why not? Jack replied. You'd never survive up there, and she wouldn't survive in the caves. But she's beautiful. She cared for me when no one else would. She showed me how to live in a completely new world. Not to mention the politics of it all, his father interrupted. We have still not mended the tensions between our tribes. We haven't spoken a word to them. Jack was silent. But I want to be with her. All she did was save your life, Jack. That's all. You can't have everything. I don't want everything. I just want to love her. She was there for me, even if it could have been anyone else. It wasn't. His father looked at him empathetically, patted him on the back, and walked away from the fireside. When Jack settled back into navigating the caves, He often thought about life above ground as he went through the caves. How his torch lit the caves like the sun and cast shadows like trees on the cave walls. How the warm breezes of above ground air felt on his skin when they passed through the caves. How the moist areas of the caves could smell like the earthy surface, and the muddy floor of the caves could feel like the earthy ground on his feet. How the sounds of the bats and the crackling of the fires almost sounded like the cacophony of noises above ground. There was more to his world underground now. He would think of Ellie. He missed her.